They were handed scraps, pig feet, corn husks, and wild greens. Yet, from almost nothing, enslaved people forged a food system that still feeds America. These were not merely dishes. They were acts of survival. Each plate carried pain, endurance, and stories most history books skip. In this video, we are revealing 25 survival foods of slaves on plantations. The overlooked meals that sustained people through one of history's darkest periods, and the hidden origins of recipes that still appear on our tables today. Stay with us. Some of these will surprise you. Parched corn. When hunger came on in the fields and there was no pot or steady fire, parched corn answered. Dried kernels were toasted until they browned and released a toasty, popping flavor. Portable, filling, and able to last for weeks without spoiling, it functioned like an early trail mix. Only this was not for leisure. It was what got people through backbreaking labor and, at times, was the entire meal for a day. You can trace echoes of parched corn to modern treats like kettle corn at a fair or the roasted corn nuts sold at highway stops. But on plantations, parched corn was more than a snack. It was survival, and unexpectedly, that plain staple helped seed Southern food traditions that persist today. Boiled cornmeal mush. If parched corn served as pocket food, boiled cornmeal mush was the hot sustenance at the end of a hard day. Cornmeal, water, and salt boiled together until they thickened into a heavy porridge. No milk, no butter, none of the extras we often add now, just enough to still a hollow stomach. This simple porridge provided calories and warmth when options were otherwise scarce. For people on plantations, it was an economical way to stretch small amounts of grain into a substantial meal. Outsiders who saw it sometimes reacted with shock at how bare it seemed, but for those who ate it, it meant endurance and continuity. Both of these items show the ingenuity that arose from enforced scarcity. With minimal ingredients and often nothing but scraps, enslaved people created nourishing, portable, and long-lasting foods. Those foods sustained daily labor in whole communities, and their influence can be traced forward into regional favorites and snack foods we recognize today. We will continue through the list, exploring the other survival dishes that carried generations through hunger, hardship, and the relentless work of plantation life. Each entry will reveal not just a recipe but a story of resilience and how those stories quietly shaped American cuisine. This dish was so common it appears again and again in slave narratives. Sometimes it was ladled into wooden troughs where children crowded with spoons, eating side by side like piglets at the pen. Brutal and humbling, but it kept them alive. What lingers is this: mush was not just a single meal. Leftovers gone cold were sliced and fried the next day, turning into something nearer polenta cakes. That simple extension, boiling once, frying twice, stretched the food and saved scraps that otherwise might have been wasted. Jump forward to the present and you still see its influence in Southern fried cornmeal cakes or Italian polenta fries on menus. For the enslaved, though, mush meant survival in its rawest form. Plain, heavy, unforgettable. Turnip green stew. When meat scraps were scarce, and they almost always were, enslaved families turned to the land itself. Turnip greens, those bitter leaves most people discarded, became the backbone of stews kept on the fire. Boiled until soft and seasoned with only a pinch of salt or, if fortune allowed, a scrap of pork fat. This was not comfort food, it was food for endurance. Greens offered more than calories. They brought strength and warmth when winter winds cut through thin clothes and bare cabins. A pot of turnip greens simmering over coals was not merely a meal. It was hope extended into a dish. Over time, that bitter, earthy taste became familiar and, in some cases, cherished. Families taught ways to tame the bite: long, slow cooking, adding roots, folding in whatever scraps could be spared. That tradition still speaks today. Walk into a southern kitchen and you will find pots of greens on the stove. Collards, mustards, or turnips, seasoned and served with cornbread. For the enslaved, however, it began as survival, not as flavor. A stew fashioned from leaves, stalks, and scraps most people would not touch. Cowpea stew. Long before black-eyed peas were a New Year's custom, they were a staple of survival on the plantations. Enslaved Africans brought knowledge of cowpeas with them across the ocean. Hardy beans that thrived in southern heat and poor soil. Cheap, filling, and full of protein. They were a lifeline when meat felt like a distant memory. Cowpea stew was straightforward. Cook the beans until tender, add a pinch of salt, maybe a scrap of pork rind if one was available. Sometimes it simmered with wild herbs or onions gathered from the fields, but more often it was simply beans and water. Plain, heavy, and sustaining. But here is the powerful twist. Cowpeas were more than survival food. They were a flavor of home. For many enslaved people, these beans were one of the few things that connected them back to Africa, where cowpeas had long been cooked into stews and porridges. Eating them was not only about filling the stomach, it was a way to hold on to identity in a world bent on erasing it. Even now, that legacy endures. Each time black-eyed peas are served with rice or simmered into Hoppin' John. What began as a stew for survival has become a symbol of luck, prosperity, and Southern tradition. But survival did not always come from seeds in a garden. Sometimes it was taken straight from the ground and boiled into something barely palatable. Dandelion greens. Boiled, soft. When you picture dandelions today, you likely see yard weeds, something to spray or yank out. For enslaved families, though, those so-called weeds were a gift from the earth. Dandelion greens grew wild, needed no planting, and filled pots when nothing else remained. Boiled until tender, the greens lost some of their bitterness, though not all of it. Occasionally, they were brightened with a splash of vinegar or a sliver of fat. But most days it was greens and water, a thin broth, a chewy bite, just enough to dull the edge of hunger. Here's the hidden beauty. Dandelions carried nutrients, iron, vitamins, strength. Plantation owners may not have known or cared, but enslaved cooks understood that these weeds were more than filler. They were survival medicine, and that survival food did not disappear. In parts of the South, people kept eating dandelion greens well into the 20th century, and now they have come back as a fashionable superfood in upscale restaurants and health stores. Imagine that. What was once a food of necessity now goes for $5 a bundle. But if bitter weeds could be elevated to a meal, think about what happened when the rare sweetness of sugar found its way into enslaved hands. Molasses water. Molasses was plantation currency, and enslaved people rarely got to taste it. Every so often, though, they might receive a ration of molasses, thick, dark, and sticky. It was not candy, but it was sweet, and that sweetness mattered. The simplest way to stretch it was to stir a spoonful into a tin cup of water. Molasses water became a poor person's energy drink. Quick calories and a burst of sweetness in a life mostly defined by bitterness. For children, it was a rare pleasure. For adults, it was fuel, enough to keep going through another day in the fields. Sometimes it was used as medicine, too, mixed with herbs to soothe a cough or calm an upset stomach. What is striking is how this echoes forward. Molasses water was a matter of survival, but it also planted the flavor seeds of Southern desserts, barbecue sauces, and baked goods we enjoy today. That sticky sweetness helped shape the taste of a whole region. Salt pork scraps. Meat was a luxury that enslaved people almost never got to eat unless it was the bits no one else wanted. Plantation owners kept the hams, chops, and roasts, and the fat trimmings, rind, and scraps were sent to the slave quarters. Fried in a pan, those scraps rendered grease that seasoned everything from beans to greens. Boiled, they became chewy pieces in a pot of stew. What was discarded as worthless became a crucial source of flavor and sustenance. And when there was nothing but fat left, the enslaved cook saved every last drop, stretching it to season cornmeal, mush, or bitter greens. Here's the hard truth: salt pork was not handed out as a luxury. It was cheap, preserved, and deemed unfit for fine tables. Yet in the hands of enslaved people, it became central to survival cooking. That salty, smoky note ran through whole meals, turning scraps into something that tasted like a feast. And the legacy persists. You can still taste it today. Southern soul food, from collard greens simmered with ham hock to fried cabbage with bacon, traces back to those remnants. What was once discarded has become comfort. But meat scraps were not the only things enslaved cooks transformed. When gardens and fields thinned, they turned to pumpkins and wild greens, simmering them into a stew that fed entire households. Pumpkin and wild greens pottage. When provisions ran low, enslaved cooks had to make do with whatever the land offered. Pumpkins, sprouting in patches, and bitter greens from the fields often went into the same pot. The outcome was a pottage, a plain stew born of necessity rather than celebration. Cubes of pumpkin gave sweetness and substance, while the greens, tough, bitter, and stringy, stretched the pot. Sometimes the whole thing cooked with only water and salt. Other times, if fortune allowed, a shard of pork fat or a stray onion lent extra flavor. Nothing was thrown away. Nothing pretended to be fancy, but together it produced enough to share. This was more than mere food. It was survival alchemy, turning the bland, the bitter, and the unwanted into something warm and sustaining. That style of cooking taught resourcefulness and endurance. You still encounter its echo today in southern pumpkin soups, autumn stews, and the slow cooking of greens until they become tender and comforting. What began as a poor person's pottage has become a cornerstone of seasonal cooking. But pumpkins held another secret too, not just the flesh, but the seeds. Roasted pumpkin seeds. Roasted and salted, scavenged by the handful, they were the small snack that got people through the hardest days. After the pumpkin flesh went into the pot, nothing was wasted, not even the seeds. Enslaved families would wash them, dry them, and roast them over hot coals, adding a pinch of salt if they had any. The seeds became a scarce, crunchy treat. They were more than just tasty. Pumpkin seeds brought protein and fat, nutrients that were hard to come by in a diet mostly made up of grains and greens. For children in particular, a handful of roasted seeds could be the difference between going to bed hungry and sleeping with some comfort. What makes this striking is that it grew from making use of waste. What plantation kitchens often scooped out and tossed, enslaved cooks turned into something useful, even pleasurable. That impulse to save, to stretch resources, to fashion something from nothing was a form of survival. And it left a legacy. Today, roasted pumpkin seeds appear in snack bags at gas stations, are sprinkled over salads, and get marketed as superfoods in health stores. What began as food born of desperation now sells for dollars. But while seeds could be roasted into a treat, the turnip root provided another kind of sustenance. Roasted slowly until soft enough to stand in for bread or meat, the turnip became the next best thing when bread was a luxury and meat a dream. Dug from the earth, scrubbed, and roasted in the ashes, the root changed from hard and bitter to soft, earthy, and faintly sweet. Enslaved families used roasted turnips as filler, something to quiet hunger when cornmeal ran out. Sometimes eaten plain, sometimes mashed, and sometimes sliced thin and fried in pork fat if scraps were on hand. It was a poor person's potato, a survival person's bread. Yet roasting drew out a richness that could make it feel almost like a treat. Imagine the smell of a smoky fire, the root blackened on the outside and steaming on the inside. It was more than just food. It was a kind of warmth you could hold on a cold night. That habit did not fade away. Roasted root vegetables became staples in Southern home cooking, at church suppers, and even on holiday tables. What began as food for survival carved out a lasting role in American culinary life. If turnip roots filled stomachs, the next dish tied flavors straight back to Africa. A mash of corn and okra. Okra did not originate in America. It crossed the ocean on slave ships, carried in memory and in seeds hidden in cloth. On southern plantations, it thrived in the heat, and enslaved cooks combined it with the one crop they always had: corn. The outcome was okra and corn mash, a plain, filling dish that linked people directly to their homeland. Typically made by slicing okra pods thin and boiling them down with ground corn grits until the mixture became a thick, sticky stew. The mash could be slimy at times or grainy at others, but it always served to fill a stomach. When scraps of pork or a bit of onion were available, they were tossed in to add flavor. Most evenings, though, it was simply those two staples: corn and okra. There is a deeper layer to this food. Every mouthful was about survival, certainly, but it was also a way of keeping culture alive. Okra stews and corn porridges were part of African diets long before captivity. So when enslaved families combined them in America, they were doing more than eating. They were safeguarding a part of themselves. You can still find that legacy today. Gumbo, succotash, and many southern okra preparations trace their roots to that simple mash. What began in slave quarters out of necessity grew into flavors woven into the South's culinary identity. When nothing could be grown in fields or gardens, survival sometimes meant foraging, including seeking out the sweet fruit of the persimmons tree. People foraged persimmons to eat raw or to mash. Sweetness was rare on the plantation table, which is why persimmons felt like small treasures. Growing wild in southern woods and fields, these little orange fruits appeared harmless enough. But if you bit into one too soon, your mouth would pucker at the bitter, astringent taste. Wait until the first frost, though, and that same fruit softened, sweetened, and turned a golden color. Enslaved families knew that trick. They gathered persimmons late in the season, eating them fresh or smashing them into a pulp. Sometimes they dried that pulp into thin cakes to carry as pocket food for long days in the fields. Other times they stirred the mash into water to make a kind of sweet drink. Nature's own answer to molasses. Persimmons were not just about taste. They were about luck, timing, and intimate knowledge of the land. Knowing exactly when to pick them, how to prepare them, and how to stretch a small harvest could mean the difference between a bitter mistake and a rare, sweet moment in a life that was mostly hard. And persimmons did not vanish. You can still find them in southern backyards, turned into puddings, breads, and even country wine. What began as a foraged survival fruit became a quiet treasure of southern cooking. But fruit was not always available. More often, survival meant making do with broken grains, the cast-off pieces of rice that planters saw as worthless, broken rice porridge. Carolina middlings. On Carolina plantations, rice was king. Yet enslaved families almost never ate the polished fine grains that filled the planters' tables. What they received were the middlings, broken bits left after milling. To the owners, it was waste. To the enslaved, it was everything. Those fragments were boiled into a thin porridge. Sometimes it was salted, sometimes mixed with bits of beans or greens, but most often it was simply rice and water. It was not fancy. It did not sustain for long, but it provided the fuel needed for another day of labor. Here is the striking part. Enslaved Africans arrived with deep knowledge of rice cultivation and of cooking. They understood how to draw flavor and nourishment from even broken grains. In doing so, they kept alive not only their bodies, but also their culture. That broken rice porridge was a lifeline. Over time, stretching plain rice into soups, porridges, and stews became essential in southern kitchens. Even now, dishes like rice gruel or congee-style porridges carry on that same survival instinct. When rice ran out, enslaved families turned to what the woods provided: wild fruits clinging to vines, stained fingers purple. Wild muscadine grapes. Deep in the southern woods, tangled vines held a secret. muscadine grapes, thick-skinned and full of juice. These wild grapes were not the neat, seedless kind seen in stores today. They were messy, tart, and at moments sweet enough to feel like a small miracle. For enslaved families, muscadines were a rare taste of abundance. Children foraged for them, their hands and mouths stained purple, while adults mashed the fruit into pulps or boiled it down to make juice. Gather enough and the fruit could be preserved into syrups, a way to stretch that sweetness through the lean months. There was a deeper meaning to it. Muscadines were more than food, they were freedom food. They grew outside the plantation's oversight, in woods and thickets, ready for the taking if you knew where to look. Finding them was a small act of independence, a reminder that the land still offered gifts even in the harshest times. Muscadines never left Southern life. Today they are turned into jellies, wines, and juices, celebrated as a native fruit. What once helped keep hunger at bay now sits bottled on store shelves. The next food was no gift from the land. It came from the slaughterhouse, a cut so unwanted most people avoided it: the cow's tongue. Boiled cow tongue. On the plantation, the best cuts of beef never made it to the slave quarters. But when a cow was butchered, pieces like the tongue, tough, fatty, and often considered undesirable, sometimes did. Enslaved cooks wasted nothing, and boiled cow tongue became an example of survival and resourcefulness. The preparation was simple. The tongue was scrubbed, boiled for hours until it softened, and then sliced thin. Sometimes a pinch of salt or a splash of vinegar gave it a bit more flavor, but most often it was eaten as is, chewy, dense, and filling. The truth is, tongue was not just a scrap. It provided rare protein and fat in a diet that relied mostly on grains and greens. For families who had to stretch vegetables and corn into meals, having real meat, even if it was tongue, felt like a small victory. What is striking is how that humble piece of meat changed status over time. Today, beef tongue is treated as a delicacy in many cuisines, from tacos de lengua in Mexico to deli-style tongue sandwiches in New York. What enslaved people once ate out of necessity is now a premium menu item. When meat was scarce, survival meant returning to the grind, literally, with cracked corn boiled into plain grits. Cracked corn grits, plain. If there was one food that never vanished from the slave diet, it was corn. Ground very fine, it became mush. Left in larger pieces, it became grits. Enslaved families simmered cracked corn in water until it swelled and softened into a thick, simple porridge. No butter, no cream, no cheese, just corn and water. That dish filled stomachs without offering indulgence. It was survival fuel. Heavy enough to quiet hunger, simple enough to make in a single pot, and cheap enough to be on hand all the time. Day after day, grits appeared at the table in some form, morning or night. Here is the part that lingers. Even though they were plain, grits became a cornerstone of Southern cooking. Over time, with seasoning, milk, or gravy, they evolved from food of survival into food of comfort. But in the slave quarters, plain grits were often the first mouthful of the day and sometimes the only one. It is a stark reminder of how staples persist. Today, grits show up dressed with shrimp in upscale restaurants or smothered with cheese at diners. But their origin is far grimmer. A bowl of cracked corn, keeping bodies alive under impossible conditions. And while grits provided physical warmth, enslaved families also sought heat from the woods in another form. They steeped the roots of sassafras trees to make a survival tea. Sassafras root tea. When plain water grew tasteless, people turned to the forest to add flavor. The root of the sassafras tree, dug from the soil and boiled, produced a tea unlike most others, earthy, aromatic, with a subtle sweetness. Long before root beer existed in bottles, sassafras root tea served as a drink of survival. It was not only about flavor. Sassafras was thought to have medicinal qualities. A steaming cup soothed coughs, eased fevers, and offered comfort when formal medicine was out of reach. For those forced to labor from sunup to sundown with little rest, that relief mattered. Here's the striking part. Enslaved cooks were not merely boiling roots from sheer need. They brought herbal knowledge from Africa and gained new practices from Native Americans, blending traditions as a means to endure. Sassafras became more than a beverage. It was resilience in a cup. That survival tea left a lasting impression. Centuries later, its taste helped inspire root beer, a drink enjoyed around the world. But its beginnings were not frosty glasses of sweet soda. They were enslaved families gathered by firelight, warming themselves with a brew made from a root pulled from the earth. Not everything taken from the land was brewed or boiled. Some items were preserved. Cucumbers and peppers dropped into brine to last through the lean months. Pickled cucumbers and peppers were brine preserved. Fresh produce did not keep long in the slave quarters, so preservation became a means of stretching what little harvest they had. With only salt, water, and time, enslaved cooks transformed cucumbers and peppers into sharp, tangy pickles that could last for weeks. The method was straightforward. Slice the vegetables, pack them into jars or crocks, and pour over the brine. After a few days, the crunch softened, but the flavor intensified. Sour, salty, and sometimes spicy when peppers were included. For families whose meals were plain corn mush or bitter greens, a pickle on the side offered a burst of flavor that made those survival meals more tolerable. Pickling was never only about flavor, it was also about security. When gardens and fields failed to produce, those jars of preserved vegetables meant there was still something to fall back on. A sour bite in the depth of winter could be the difference between another day of strength and the edge of hunger. The tradition stuck in southern kitchens. Chow chow, pepper relish, bread and butter pickles all trace their origins to those first brined jars on the plantation. What began as necessity gradually became custom. Not all survival foods came from the garden, though. Sometimes survival meant breaking open the hardest gifts from the woods, like black walnuts. Bitter and stubborn, they demanded effort, but they were worth it. If you have ever split a black walnut, you know it is no easy task. The shells are thick, the stain sinks into your hands, and the meat hides deep inside. For enslaved families, black walnuts were worth every blow from a rock or hammer. Gathered from the forest floor, the nuts were prized for their richness. Once opened, the kernels provided protein, fat, and a flavor much stronger than common walnuts. Sometimes they were eaten raw, other times they were chopped into porridge or used to stretch a simple dessert when molasses was on hand. Here's the deeper truth. Black walnuts were more than food. They were survival treasure. Each nut cracked represented stored energy, a small victory against hunger. Families saved them for lean months or carried them into the fields for a quick boost. Over time, that resource left a mark. Black walnut cake, black walnut ice cream, even old-fashioned candies all trace back to a food enslaved people first made use of out of necessity. When nuts and fruit were not available, survival could mean scraping the core of the garden itself, boiling down cabbage hearts and stems that others discarded. The crisp outer leaves of cabbage might reach the owner's table, while the tough, woody cores were cast aside. Enslaved cooks learned to turn those cast-offs into nourishment. In the slave quarters, cabbage cores were not thrown away. They were simmered down, softened, and turned into a stew that kept people going. The cores were chopped and cooked for hours until the fibers broke apart. Sometimes a pinch of salt or, if luck allowed, a scrap of pork fat gave them flavor. More often it was just cabbage and water. Thin and bland, but warm and filling enough to ease an empty stomach. What is striking is that enslaved families had no luxury of waste. What others discarded, they learned to use. Those cabbage cores bulked up the pot and stretched scarce provisions a bit further. In a world where every calorie mattered, those scraps made a difference. That practical approach left a trace on Southern cooking. Even now, regional recipes still use the whole vegetable. Stewed cabbage, braised stalks, even pickled stems. What started as desperation cooking became folded into the area's culinary identity. Not all methods of preservation were so plain. Sometimes survival came with a kick, as with green tomato chow chow, a tangy relish that brightened otherwise dull meals. When harvest ended and tomatoes stayed green on the vine, enslaved cooks refused to let them go to waste. They chopped the unripe tomatoes, combined them with peppers, onions, vinegar, and salt, and simmered the mix into a sharp relish called chow chow. It was bright, tangy, and a little spicy, the kind of flavor that could cut through the heaviness of beans, corn mush, or boiled greens. A spoonful on the side could turn plain survival food into something that woke the taste buds. In a world where meals were often bitter or bland, that mattered a great deal. There is a larger point here. Chow chow was more than a flavoring. It was a preservation method. By pickling and spicing produce that would not ripen, enslaved families stretched their food into the cold months when gardens were bare. It was a survival tactic tucked into a jar of relish, and its influence endures. Today, Southern tables, from barbecue spots to Sunday suppers, still serve chow chow alongside meats, beans, and cornbread. What began as a way to stretch leftovers grew into a Southern custom with roots tied to the slave quarters. When vegetables could not fill the gap, people turned back to the earth. They roasted roots to make a bitter brew that stood in for coffee. Chicory coffee, or roasted chicory brew. Coffee itself was a luxury kept for the big house. In the slave quarters, enslaved families made their own stand-in. They dug up the roots of the chicory plant, roasted them until dark, and ground them into a coarse powder. Steeped in hot water, it yielded a bitter, smoky drink that resembled coffee in look and feel, even though it was not the same. For many, chicory brew was more than flavor. It was ritual. Having a warm cup at dawn before heading to the fields or late at night when the body ached offered comfort and a small measure of dignity. Sometimes that bitter cup even tricked the mind into believing it was the real thing. The surprising part is that chicory did not disappear after emancipation. In New Orleans in particular, it became part of local tradition. To this day, well-known cafes sometimes mix chicory with coffee, serving a beverage that traces back to the resourcefulness of enslaved people who made do with what they had. So while the masters drank imported beans, the enslaved drank roasted roots. Both cups were hot, both carried meaning, but only one grew out of survival. When roots themselves could not soothe hunger, cooks in the quarters turned to the smallest scraps. Bones tossed away and boiled down into broths that sustained families through famine. When the meat was gone, when fat and trimmings had been picked clean, one thing often remained: the bones. Plantation kitchens discarded them, but in the slave quarters nothing went to waste. Enslaved families collected those cast-off bones, put them in a pot of water, and simmered them for hours. The result was scrap bone broth, thin and oily, yet full of whatever nutrients the marrow would yield. It was not a hearty stew. Most of the time there was no meat left on the bone. But by simmering them slowly, those bones released flavor, strength, and just enough fat to stretch plain corn mush or a handful of greens. For children, and for the sick, that broth could be the difference between collapse and another day's labor. Here is the uncomfortable truth. Bone broth today is marketed as a health craze, bottled, branded, and expensive. Yet its origins lie in survival cooking in slave quarters, where it was never about trends or wellness. It was about making do, about staying alive with bones picked nearly bare. When survival demanded more, people turned back to the fields for the simplest harvest of all: fresh green corn roasted in its husk over an open fire. In late summer, while the ears were still tender on the stalk, enslaved families would slip into the fields and pull a few. The easiest way to eat them was to throw the whole ear, husk and all, onto hot coals. After a few minutes, the husk blackened, the kernels steamed, and the roasted green corn was ready. The taste was smoky, sweet, and filling. It was a rare pleasure that required no pot, no seasonings, no scraps of meat, only fire and patience. Children especially loved it, chewing down to the cob and savoring every bite. For adults, it was quick fuel after brutal days of work, a way to enjoy the harvest before the plantation crews picked the fields clean. Here's the striking part. Roasted corn was not only survival food, it was joy. One of the rare moments when eating felt like receiving a gift instead of getting a ration. Gathered around the fire with husks in their hands, enslaved families found a small taste of freedom in a humble ear of corn. That custom lived on. Today, roasted corn appears at fairs, festivals, and backyard cookouts across America. What once meant endurance now stands for celebration. The final dish on this list brings us back to the wild. A thin, sharp broth made from onions and garlic pulled straight from the ground. In fields and woods, enslaved families foraged not only for greens and fruit, but for the pungent bite of wild onions and wild garlic. These hardy plants grew along ditches and at the edges of woods. Boiled in water, they yielded a thin, sharp soup. It was not a rich stew. More often, it was just broth. Clear, light, carrying only the taste of those wild bulbs. But in a life marked by constant hunger, even that thin broth held power. Rich in sulfur, the plants helped ward off illness, cleared the chest, and gave a warming sensation when bellies were otherwise empty. Children might sip the liquid like medicine, while adults drank it to make it through long nights. When a pinch of salt, a scrap of pork, or a bit of fat could be spared, the broth became something closer to a real meal. That small addition changed the soup from mere sustenance into comfort, however modest. Here is the legacy. Today, onions and garlic form the backbone of nearly every cuisine. For the enslaved, their wild cousins were more than seasoning. They were survival, a bitter broth that kept bodies going through the hardest days. And so we come full circle. From roasted corn to bitter greens, from scrap bones to wild herbs, each dish repeats the same story. Survival shaped a struggle in a food culture that still lives on in Southern kitchens.